There's something a little strange about the way most people think about food security. They picture warehouses, canned goods, stockpiles behind locked doors, and maybe that image makes sense given everything that's happened in the last few years. But there's another version of this, quieter, older, and honestly kind of hiding in plain sight. Most people walk past it every single day. I want to start with something that might sound a little odd at first. There are plants growing right now, probably within 100 feet of where you're sitting, that people ate for centuries before grocery stores existed. Plants that survived droughts, hard winters, poor soil, plants that came back year after year without anyone doing anything. And somewhere along the way, we just stopped noticing them, stopped recognizing them as food. That's not a conspiracy or anything dramatic. It's more like a slow forgetting, the kind that happens when things get too convenient for too long. I honestly wasn't sure where to start with this, because once you begin looking into which plants are actually edible and nutritious versus which ones are just decorative or considered weeds, the list gets a lot longer than most people expect. And some of them are genuinely surprising. Take Purslane. If you've ever had a garden or even just a sidewalk crack or a weedy patch near a driveway, you've probably seen it. Low to the ground, thick, fleshy leaves, almost succulent looking. Most people pull it out without thinking. Some people spray it. Here's the part that didn't quite register for me the first time I read it. Purslane has more omega-3 fatty acids than almost any other land plant. We're talking about a nutrient that most Americans are chronically low on, one that's typically associated with expensive fish oil supplements or wild-caught salmon, and it's growing in sidewalk cracks for free. Now, I'll be honest, some of the health claims floating around about Purslane get a little exaggerated online, the way these things tend to. But the nutritional data on it is pretty well documented. It's real food. It's been eaten in Mediterranean cooking, in Middle Eastern cuisine, in parts of Mexico and Asia for a long time. It's not obscure in most of the world. It's only obscure here. And the reason for that is interesting if you think about it. In the United States, the plants that got elevated into mainstream food culture were the ones that could be industrialized. Crops that worked well in large-scale monoculture, that could be harvested by machine, that had long shelf lives and consistent shapes. Purslane doesn't fit that model. It's low, sprawling, delicate once cut. It doesn't ship well, it doesn't photograph the way a head of romaine does, so it quietly dropped off the radar. Not because it stopped being nutritious, just because it stopped being profitable. The daylily thing is a different kind of surprise. If you live in a suburban neighborhood almost anywhere in the eastern half of the country, daylilies are just background. They're along roadsides, in front yards, in those overgrown corners of properties nobody maintains anymore. Orange flowers, strap-like leaves, spread aggressively, come back every year. People treat them like furniture, just part of the landscape. What most people don't know is that the entire plant is edible. Young shoots in early spring taste somewhere between asparagus and green onion. The flower buds, right before they open, have a texture and flavor that people often compare to green beans. The flowers themselves are edible. The tubers underground taste mild and slightly sweet, similar to a water chestnut. There's a small but important caveat here. True daylilies, Hemerocallis species, are edible. Other types of lilies are not, and some are actually toxic. So if you're going to forage anything, making sure you know exactly what you have matters. That part isn't optional. But for the majority of people with daylilies already growing in their yard, or on a neighbor's property, or along a roadside they pass every day, there's a food source that's already established, already spreading, already perennial, requiring nothing from them. It just never occurred to anyone to look at it that way. I keep coming back to that phrase, it never occurred to anyone. Because that's really what's happening here. It's not that this information is hidden. It's not secret. Most of it is documented in foraging guides that have existed for decades, in agricultural history books, in ethnobotany research. It's more that there's a cultural filter we all carry around, one that was probably built in childhood that sorts plants into categories: food, weed, decoration, danger. And once something lands in the weed category, it's very hard to see it any other way. That filter gets reinforced constantly by what's in grocery stores, by what gets sold at farmers markets, by what gets featured in cooking shows and food media. The same small cast of vegetables shows up over and over, and everything outside that cast becomes invisible. The strange thing is that the plants outside that cast are often tougher, older, more adapted to irregular conditions. A lot of what ended up in the weed category is there precisely because it couldn't be controlled. It spread too easily, it grew in the wrong places, it didn't cooperate with modern agriculture's need for predictability. Those same traits are actually the ones that matter when conditions get less predictable. There's a version of this that goes deeper than just foraging. Some of the most interesting crops from a food security standpoint are perennial vegetables, plants that don't need to be replanted every year. You put them in the ground once and they come back, sometimes for decades. Sea kale is one that almost nobody in the US grows, but it can produce for 20 years from a single planting. It's one of the first things up in early spring, before most garden vegetables are even being started indoors. Good King Henry is another one. Been eaten in Europe for centuries, grows in partial shade where most vegetables won't, and once it establishes itself, it just quietly produces year after year. Neither of these is flashy. Neither of them shows up in seed catalogs prominently or gets much coverage in mainstream gardening content. Part of that is commercial. Perennials don't need to be repurchased every year the way annual seeds do. There's less money in them, but there's also something deeper happening. A lot of modern gardening culture, even the homesteading version, is still built around the annual cycle. You plant in spring, you tend through summer, you harvest in fall, and then you start over. That rhythm feels natural. It's what most people learned. But it's also surprisingly fragile if conditions change. A late frost, a dry summer, a season where you can't get outside consistently. Annual crops punish interruption, perennials absorb it. There's something kind of uncomfortable about sitting with this, if you let yourself really think about it. Most of us live surrounded by edible plants we don't recognize. We've essentially forgotten a layer of knowledge that humans carried for thousands of years. How to look at a landscape and understand what it offers. And that knowledge didn't disappear because it was no longer true. It disappeared because we built systems that made it feel unnecessary, which works fine when those systems work perfectly. I'm not trying to be dramatic about it. Most of the time they do, but the last several years have had enough supply chain moments, enough grocery store gaps, enough seasons where things felt briefly unstable, that a lot of people started quietly wondering whether it made sense to understand more about the land around them than they currently do. Not out of panic, more like a slow recognition that maybe the knowledge gap is larger than they realized. The irony is that starting is pretty simple. Purslane doesn't need to be planted. You just have to stop pulling it. Daylilies, if you already have them, are already there. Ground cherries will reseed themselves every year once you grow them once. Walking onions are nearly indestructible, come back every spring, and you can divide them to make more. These are not high-maintenance crops. They're the opposite of that. There's something almost counterintuitive about it. The plants that require the least from you tend to be the ones we know least about because they never needed to be cultivated the way commodity crops did. They just grew and kept growing and got ignored in the process. The biggest barrier most people run into with foraging isn't motivation, it's confidence and identification. Because the difference between a daylily and a toxic lily, or between purslane and something that just looks similar, actually matters. And most people aren't going to pull up a website or dig through a thick field guide every time they step outside. There's a wallet-sized folding guide called the Foldable Forager that covers over 55 edible plants across North America. Full-color images, edible parts, where to find them, even how to prepare them. The kind of thing you tuck into a glove box or a backpack pocket and don't think about until the moment you actually need it. I'll leave a link in the description for anyone who wants to take a look. I think what stays with me about all of this isn't really the specific plants. It's the question underneath it. How many other things are like this? How many things are right in front of us, technically available, technically known, but filtered out by assumptions we never consciously chose? Purslane growing through a crack in the driveway gets sprayed because it looks like a weed. Daylilies spread along a fence line and nobody thinks about them, except to note that they need to be cut back. A perennial vegetable that could grow in the shady corner of a yard for 2 decades stays off the list because nobody put it on a seed rack at the hardware store. The knowledge isn't gone, it's just sitting quietly, waiting to be noticed again, which is a little strange when you think about it. That in a moment when so many people are trying to figure out how to be more prepared, more self-sufficient, less dependent on systems that sometimes fail, some of the most useful answers might not be products or preparations at all. They might just be plants that were there the whole time.